introduce our presenter, Nora Gross. She's a member of the Wyoming State Network for Language Access, WYNSLA. She is from Columbia. She has a bachelor's in international business and a master's in a BA and a master's in Spanish as well. Nora has over 20 years experience as a business interpreter and translator, working in multinational companies from the United States to Europe and Latin America. She is also a qualified community interpreter and a registered legal interpreter in Wyoming, as well as a college instructor. Thank you, Nora, and I will let you get started. We do have, let's see if I can just quickly, before she gets started, the agenda here so that you can kind of look at that real quick before Nora gets started. But she will be presenting in about 1 minute, and we'll have questions and answers, and then we'll have announcements, wrap up, and next steps. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Nora, you can get started with yours at any time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see it?
I can. How about everyone else?
They're muted.
I can see it on my screen, so it's good.
Okay.
I think
okay,
everyone.
So hello everyone, and thank you for being with us today. With our WYNSLA group, we saw the need of having a presentation about how to work with an interpreter for the law professionals, just to better understand what we need as an interpreter during an interpretation. In order to put together this presentation, I used many documents about the best practices for interpreters, and I also used feedback from other legal interpreters as well as my own experience. So this presentation is for law professionals, but also for the interpreters. The purpose of the presentation is to help everybody that is involved in a legal interpretation to better understand the interpreter's job and how to improve the communication flow when they have to use an interpreter. So if you're an attorney, a caseworker, a probation officer, public defender, district attorney, or judge, I will refer to this group as law professionals, you will get some key tips and things to avoid when using an interpreter. If you are already a legal interpreter, you will have access to information that will make your job easier. And if you're not yet a legal interpreter, you will find out how to become one. I will as well talk about the different types of legal interpreters and give information where to find the legal interpreters and why it is important to use a trained interpreter. And I will explain the difference between the different modes of interpreting. So please feel free to use this information, to share it, use it as a tool. You can find the presentation itself and the resources. There's a link in the chat box, and everything is on the Office of Health Equity website. So the very first thing I want to do is to talk about two terms that are normally confused, that is interpreter versus translator. So interpreters convey spoken material from one language into a different language, while translator convey written material. So this is the main difference. And this presentation is going to be about interpreters. Here I have the two big groups of interpreters. First is the community interpreting, and the other one is legal interpreting. This is important so you will find or understand a little better the difference between the two groups. The first one, the community interpreting, has to do with medical and health, education, social services, and faith-based. While the legal interpreting has to do with all that has to do with legal proceedings that happen in courts, lawyers' offices, detention centers, also when there's law enforcement, cases about immigration, probation, child and family services, and in situations of mediation and arbitration. Also what happens is that these two big groups sometimes intersect. So for example, it happens when there's a case, a workers' comp case. Part of it has to do with health, so it's community, and part of it has to do with legal, that's all the part of the injury at work. Other examples of these is, for example, in a psychiatric evaluation, where there's an involuntary admission of a patient to an institution. So part of the interpretation has to do with the mental health, and another part has to do with the legal issues. In Wyoming, it's very hard to find a full-time interpreter, and this is due to the low amount of LEP individuals in the state. LEP stands for Limited English Proficient. So many interpreters will have to work in both areas, the community and the legal. And this makes it sometimes very challenging because each of them are different. And you have to learn different terminologies, and it's hard to become specialized. That I'm aware, only Jackson Hole has full-time medical interpreters with 122. And this is one of the reasons why it's hard to find interpreters in Wyoming, because there's no enough business to make a living of interpreting. So many interpreters combine interpreting with other professions. Like in my case, I am a Spanish teacher too. Let's talk about now the type of interpreters. The first is the certified interpreter. And this is an interpreter who has taken professional training and has passed a valid and reliable exam. These exams are administered by independent entities such as the National Center for State Courts, or sometimes the states itself. We don't have any certification programs in Wyoming, but nearby states have them, like Colorado, Utah, and Montana. And some of the requirements depend on the state, but this is general information. They will have to take an orientation course, pass a written test in English. Also, there's tests about the code of ethics, training courses up to 5 days. They have examination tests on practical assessment with different modes of interpretations. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 parts of them. And also 10 or more hours of observation. The next level is the registered interpreter. So this is an interpreter who has taken the Wyoming Supreme Court training and passed the written English with 70% or better. And also they have to take the OPI, the Oral Proficiency Interview, and they have to score at least Advanced Mid. At the end of this presentation, Sierra Hipsky from the Wyoming Supreme Court is going to give us some information about a training that is coming to Casper, if I'm not wrong, next week. So where can you find information about these interpreters? Well, we have 2 resources here. The first is the link to the Wyoming Supreme Court. Here, there's the Wyoming Supreme Court interpreter roster. So if I click here, I will get the whole list and all the information. The first you can see here is the certified interpreters. As I said, we don't have any programs in Wyoming, and the only one in this list is the person who lives in Colorado. The rest is the registered Spanish interpreters, and these are located in different cities. You have all the information here. And also we have here registered American Sign Language interpreters that we have 2, one in Casper and one in Cheyenne. The other resource is the WYNSLA database. I'm opening right now. Okay, this is it. And here we have information
Nora,
about, yes?
You'll need to bring it to the front because right now we're only seeing your slides. If you wanted to share that.
Bring it to the front.
I think you'll have to stop sharing or stop doing the presentation and then start up again. Yep, I think that's going to work.
Thank you. Thank you for telling me that. I didn't know. Okay, can you see it now? Lillian, can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so here we have the WYNSLA database, where we have the first information we'll see on the left is if the person resides in the county. This is organized by counties. If there's an X here, the person lives in the county, otherwise they live somewhere else and they're willing to travel. All the information, and then the languages they work with. We have French, Portuguese, Spanish, and sign language. And also the training they have completed. So if they have community, court, medical, others. And the last thing is if they work also translating documents. So here you will find information. This general information is not only for court interpreters or for legal interpreters, it's for all kinds of interpreters. Okay, so I have to go back then. Okay, give me a minute because this is not working. Okay. Okay, I'm back here. So that's about the registered interpreters in Wyoming. Then we have, oh, I don't know what happened. Okay, sorry. We have the next level is what is called qualified interpreter. And I want to explain these because there's a difference between what is a qualified interpreter for legal and what is a qualified interpreter. So for legal, a qualified interpreter, it's a language interpreter who has not achieved certification or registration requirements. So it's not in the first level, it's not in the second level. But somehow the local court has found the person qualified. I really don't have information how they do this. I don't know if the local court has somebody that can assess the person or how this works. So I will say it's a bilingual individual that has some sort of degree of proficiency in the two languages. While a qualified interpreter for the community interpreter is very different. It's an individual who has completed professional training. So this is 40 hours training and has been able to demonstrate a high level of proficiency in at least 2 languages. So to be a registered interpreter, you need to take the OPI for 1 language. To be a community interpreter, you need to take the assessment or the oral assessment for both languages you're working. And you need to take also a written exam at the end of the training and pass it with at least 80% or more. And I have an example. At the end of the course, you will receive a certificate of completion. This is an example of that, where you will see the name of the person and if the level of the interpreter. So the highest level is the qualified interpreter. And it says here, score superior or advanced high for language proficiency. And I'll show you guys here in a little bit that scale to better understand these. And it says this person may be capable of handling the more challenging or technical assignments. If the person is scored lower than advanced high, then it will go to the other levels. It could be professionally trained or hospitality interpreter. So let's take a look at that scale. This scale is from the American Council of the Teaching of Foreign Languages. It's called as known as ACTFL. And you see here the different levels. The lowest is and the highest is superior. And after taking the oral interview, the OPI, they will give you this score. And for legal, to be registered interpreter, you need to score at least advanced, mid, or higher. For community interpreter, to be a qualified interpreter, you need to score advanced, high, or superior. Okay, let's talk then how interpreting works. So really, interpreting is a very complex process that involves many cognitive functions. And here we will see the different steps. The average person speaks at somewhere between 125 to 150 words per minute. And so this in an hour will be about 7,500 words. So this is a good amount of words that an interpreter has to be interpreting. The steps are, the first one is active listening. So part of the proper working conditions for an interpreter is the ability to hear everything that people is saying. So for example, if we're in a courtroom, everything that people is saying in a courtroom. So if someone is speaking too fast or too softly, or if the attorneys are facing away from the interpreter, this is not good because the interpreter cannot hear. If you cannot hear what is being said, you cannot interpret it. After active listening, then you need to understand what this person is saying. You need to analyze the information, edit it and translate it kind of pretty much at the same time, and then make a conversion to the other language and deliver the message. All this happens in seconds. At the same time, you have to conserve the language level and the register. This register is the complexity or the level of formality in which you speak. So for example, if the attorney says, "What did you observe the subject do subsequently?" You should not interpret that as, "What did you see him do next?" Or the word depart versus the word go. So what happened with this is that the interpreter cannot try to bring the question down to the witness level. Also, the interpreter should not intervene and say that he or she thinks the question is not understandable to the witness. The interpreter also needs to conserve style, tone, and the intent of the speaker. So, a common error is the belief that any person that knows two languages can interpret. Is it true? Can a person that knows both languages do all these things at the same time with a high quality? That's the big question. Let's talk now about the modes of interpreting. There are three modes of interpreting: simultaneous, consecutive, and side translation. The first one, simultaneous, is rendering an interpretation continuously at the same time someone is speaking. For example, this happens in conferences where the interpreter is in a booth and is using equipment. The attendees are also using equipment and listening to what the interpreter is saying. In court, we use a variation of this mode of interpreting that is called whispering or chuchotage, that comes from French. Here we're not using equipment, okay? And this mode is used when the judge is not talking to the defendant. So for example, when the DA is saying something or the public defendant is saying something, that's when the simultaneous interpretation takes place. There's always a delay because the speaker is saying things and the interpreter is interpreting. Cannot be at the same pace. There's always a delay. And also, it's important to notice here that the interpreter's voice makes it harder to hear what is being said. That's why it's so important to speak up, that the speaker needs to be speaking up. Otherwise, the interpreter cannot hear what is being said. And also, it's key to understand here that the amount of words between one language and the other are different. So in the case of English and Spanish, when you interpret from one language to the other, there's about 30% more words in Spanish than in English. An example of these: if, let's say the attorney says deposition, the word deposition. Deposition in Spanish is declaración oral jurada. Those are 3 words. So the delay is big. The next mode of interpreting is consecutive. This is when the interpreter renders an interpretation after the speaker has stopped speaking. This happens when the judge talks to the defendant, or for example, at an interview at a detention center. Here, the interpreter is taking notes in order to avoid frequent interruptions and also for accuracy. And this is one of the skills key to develop for interpreters. The last one is side translation, and this is the oral rendition of a written text from one language into another. Here is recommended to avoid documents that are too complex or too extensive, to ask the interpreter to sight translate on the spot, things that are, has those characteristics. Because it takes time to do a good translation of legal terms. Normally, written documents are more formal and more complex than verbal expression. So it frequently happens that family members are used as interpreters because they're free. But it's important to consider that friends and family members have personal and emotional attachments, that's for sure. They usually do not want to confuse or upset their loved one, and they don't want to be carriers of bad news. So their friends and family interpreters can end up adding things like their own opinions or withholding crucial parts of the message. So maybe the person can speak two languages, but if they don't have training as interpreters, then you need to ask yourself these questions. Is this person fluent in the legal and technical terminology? Is this person aware of the professional and ethical responsibilities of trained interpreters? An example of this is interpreters have to interpret everything that is being said. So if a person omit keywords or summarize the message, they're just not following this ethical responsibility. And this is going to result in an inaccurate interpretation. Let's look at a few tips here. The first one is to plan for extra time when using an interpreter. It's going to take about double time. So if normally a session takes 1 hour, with an interpreter it could take 2. Also speaking meaningful segments that mean complete thoughts, to make frequent pauses and pause after you finish talking to give the interpreter enough time to interpret. Remember, there's a delay, and especially when using simultaneous, the interpreter, there's a delay, so it's important to speak at a lower pace than usual. The next part is to speak directly to the ELP individual. So, for example, do not say, ask him where he was that night. Instead, you should say something like, where were you that night? Or the seating or the positioning is important. It needs to be something that promotes direct communication between the two parties. So I have here, I have the lawyer and the ELP individuals, and the interpreter could be slightly behind the ELP individual or on the side. So the way the lawyer and the ELP individual is looking face to face. In consecutive interpreting, it's important to wait until the interpreter is finished speaking before you speaking because of the delay. And for example, if there's a deposition, do not interrupt each other when arguing. You have to stop to wait for the interpretation, and then you can make your argument. The use of dictionaries and glossaries should not be considered negative. What happens here is that it's impossible to know all the words. It's impossible to know all the slangs. Just as an example, with Spanish, there's 21 countries that the official language is Spanish. So for an interpreter, it's impossible to know all the possible slangs in these 21 countries. So sometimes we need to use dictionaries and glossaries for accuracy. Don't expect a word-for-word translation. What we are interpreting are meanings and concepts, because oftentimes there's no direct translation of words from one language into another. So I'll give you an example here. The attorney says, what were you doing in the parking lot? The interpreter asks the question interpreting to Spanish. And the non-English speaker replies, estaba manejando mi mueble. There's 2 options for interpreting these. One is literal, that is, I was driving my furniture. And the other one, that is the right one, is I was driving my old junker. So what happens is that in Mexico, they use the word mueble which has a literal interpretation that is furniture, to mean junker or old car. So if we were interpreting words, could go saying I was driving my furniture, but really we're interpreting the meaning, and the right meaning in this case is I was driving my old junker. The next step is to provide the interpreter with the tools needed for a professional job. So if you give the interpreter information that you have available, copies of documents, motions, pleads, any kind of documents that you have before the hearing or the meeting, this allows the interpreter to do a better job. So the interpreter will interpret more accurately because they have a background context. They have specific information that you're going to be using, such as names, dates, statutes, things like that. If you, for example, going to have a deposition and you inform in advance the interpreter that it's about an accident, and maybe inform what part of the body was injured, that the person works in the construction, things like that, that allows the interpreter to prepare in advance, maybe to put together some glossaries and bring material to the session that is going to be interpreted to be able to do a better job. The next step is to avoid asking an interpreter to provide opinions about the case. Just keep in mind, interpreters are there to interpret. They are not attorneys, psychologists, or counselors. And besides that, it's against the interpreter code of ethics. And we'll be talking about the code of ethics here with this other slide, with things to avoid. So don't ask interpreters not to interpret something. Do not ask an interpreter to go over legal documents or explain legal concepts. And don't expect the interpreter to clear up misunderstandings. All these three things are against the code of ethics. And here is the code of ethics. We have here the canon number 1. It says, oh, I'm sorry. Canon number 1 says, interpreters shall render a complete and accurate interpretation or site translation without altering, omitting, or adding anything, and without an explanation. So they cannot tell us not to interpret something, and they cannot tell us to explain something without being present. So we cannot go over documents without the other person being around in order to be able to ask questions that the LP, if the LP individual has a question, that the interpreter can interpret the question and can interpret the answer provided by the lawyer or whoever we're interpreting for. Also, but because any kind of explanation that we could give, it could be considered that legal advice, if you see canon number 7, is not allowed. It says interpreters should limit themselves to interpreting and translating and should not give legal advice. More things to avoid is the use of acronyms, or if you're going to use them, explain what the acronym stands for. What happens is that acronyms are not used as much in Spanish or in other languages. So when interpreting, instead of using the acronym, normally we have to explain or give the complete term or the words that are used. An example of this, with the word DUI, I cannot interpret that literally as the letters DUI. I have to explain or give the complete term, driving under the influence. This takes more time, and sometimes some acronyms may not be known by the interpreter. So to avoid misunderstanding, it's better not to use them. And if you use advanced legal terminology, it's key to provide definitions and examples. Now let's talk about things that happen in court. The first one is very important to speak clearly and to be mindful of how you ask the questions. The best thing is to avoid lengthy questions and to avoid double negatives. There's an example of a double negative. Isn't it true that you didn't know Mr. Smith? So a possible negative answer could be, no, it is not true. Or, no, I didn't know Mr. Smith. So it is not the interpreter's responsibility to tell the attorney that the question will elicit an ambiguous response, or to clarify the answer by adding any kind of element that is not contained in the original reply. So just be careful how you phrase your questions through an interpreter. In general, the more straightforward you pose a question, the best results you're going to get. And if you're reading aloud from a document, please slow down. There's no way to keep up with somebody for interpreting for somebody that is reading at a normal pace. And very important, use the microphones, speak up. Remember I said it before that as an interpreter, it's important, or for me as an interpreter, it's important to be able to hear what you say, and my own voice is making it harder. Especially during simultaneous interpretation, this happens. When we use documents and audio recordings in foreign languages, the best thing to do is to translate or transcribe these documents well before they are going to be introduced into evidence. These tasks of translation and transcriptions are really complex, and a rush or hurried job may not produce a reliable result. Normally, the immediate rendition will often do not meet high standards. If you're gonna have a witness that is gonna testify, the person with the rhythm of questions and answers through an interpreter. It happens sometimes that in the pre-appearance interviews have revealed that the witness does not actually speak the language of the assigned interpreter. So, for example, with Chinese, this kind of things, not always they're using their right interpreter. Key to give the interpreter breaks every 20 to 30 minutes. Just giving the interpreter's brain time to regroup protects the accuracy of the interpretation. Just keep in mind the interpreter is the only person in the courtroom who is talking all the time. While everybody else is only, well, they have to understand what's being said, the interpreter has to do both. They need to understand, but also put it in another language. This is intense, demanding work. And if the proceeding takes longer than 30 minutes, it is recommended, it's just the best practice to allow the interpreter to take a break, because his or her accuracy is going to plummet after 30 minutes. And in cases for long hearings or trials, what is recommended, again, is the best practice. And I know they use these in Colorado, for example. They always, for trials, use team interpreting. How this works is that there's two interpreters that should be able to switch it off every 30 minutes or so. Because normally these proceedings involve simultaneous interpreting for more than 1 hour. So to help prevent fatigue and to ensure accuracy, that's what is suggested to do. It is just normal that there's some fatigue involved due to the degree of concentration involved. I think this is all that I had to share with you guys, and now I will be happy to answer any kind of questions. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, or you can write your question in the chat box. Okay, somebody's saying here, Idaho also has a state certification for legal interpreters. Correct. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, Merrick is asking, how do we present the information? Do you mean how do you share this information with attorneys and things like that, or what is, I'm not understanding very good your question. You might want to unmute yourself and share with us your question. Do you know how to unmute yourself, Merrick? I might be able to do it, or Lillian?
Yeah, I'm trying. Let me.
Okay. Merrick is asking the question.
Okay. Unmuted. So go ahead, Merrick.
Merrick?
I unmuted your line, so you're able to ask any questions at this time to help her clarify your question.
Oh, she's saying that her microphone is not working.
Oh, okay.
Okay, can you explain a little bit more your question? Okay, so I'm gonna go to the next person and then I'll go back to Merrick while she has chance to write. So Pilar is asking, how do I register my name in the WYNSLA database? I'm a professional translator living in Idaho. So you can go to the website for the Office of Health Equity, and
it's in the chat box.
It's in the chat box. Yeah, we have, let me see if I go to a chat box, I can. It says there, to access the presentation and resources, go to. So in that same website, you will find WYNSLA, and it says there how to, I forgot how it says, how to become a member, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's on the, it talks about what is WYNSLA, and then I think under that same tab, you would go in and add your name to the list.
Yeah, it says, how do I become a member?
Yep.
So you just click there and enter the information and submit it.
I think I'm bringing it up.
Yes.
Yep, and there's the registration right there. Once you complete that, we'll be able to add you to the list. And we only do it once a month. So if you do it at the end of this month, it'll come out November 1st with the updated list, just to help us keep it more manageable, because we have to upload it onto the website.
Okay. Then Merrick says that she meant how she can present this information to attorneys, providers, court, etc. I can't imagine myself walking and saying, here's how it's going to go from now on. I just don't know how to introduce it. Yeah. Yeah, I know, Merrick. It is a little tricky. That's one of the purposes of this presentation, is to have the information out. And now we need to share it. You can share the link. This presentation is going to be recorded, or it was recorded, and it's going to be on the website for the Office of Health Equity. And so you can share that link with whoever you want. And also you have the presentation information, so you can maybe get some, whatever you think will help you more, kind of put together a document with the key points, and also you can give that to the people you work with. That could be a way to go as well. And the idea for the future is that this presentation is also gonna be, since it's recorded, it's gonna be available in later on for demand for the law professionals to obtain what is called CLEs. That is training that they have to do every year. So we're gonna also let people access these to get CLEs. We're gonna work on that to get those CLEs approved. and to be able to incentivize a little bit more the law professionals to watch it. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay.
Did we get all the questions? We can go ahead and go on to our next announcement, and then we can always come back for questions. So
Sure.
Feel free to do that. So go ahead and introduce the next announcement if you'd like to. Nora, please.
Okay, so now we have Sierra from the Wyoming Supreme Court, and she's going to share some information about the training coming to Casper for legal interpreters next week. Hi, Sierra.
And I may need to unmute her because
Yes.
I believe that everyone got muted when they came into the webinar. So give me a second if you can go ahead and keep talking about what she's going to be talking about until I get her managed. I don't know where it's at. Let's see if I go down here. Oh yeah, here she is, unmuted. So she should be able to go ahead and talk now.
Go ahead, Sierra.
Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have a court interpreter orientation coming up in Casper from October 24th through 25th. It will be held at the Casper Circuit Court. It will be 8 hours over a 2-day period. So in the afternoon on the 24th and the morning of the 25th. If you're interested in the program, you can go ahead and let us know if you'd like to register. We just ask that you do so by Monday. Once you take the orientation, you'll have a written test at the end of the orientation. Once that is passed, you'll have an oral exam in your interpreting language, which is over the phone, and you'll have to have an advanced minimum score or better to be placed on our registered roster. And I'll let you know that currently we only have a couple of people registered. So if we don't have at least 6 people, we will cancel the orientation.
Oh.
And you all are looking, you should be looking at the court interpreter program agenda for those both days right now. That is up on your screen. And the contact information as well is on that second page on the second day. Elisa Butler is our interpreter program administrator, and her email and phone number is on there as well. And we have our application that's also available on our website, which is just the Wyoming Supreme Court. And if you go over to our court admin tab, you can go down to court interpreters and you can find more information about our court interpreter program. There's interpreter application under forms, which we'll need to receive if you do wish to register for the class, and you can also bring that the day of orientation. We'll just need to know that you'd like to register again by Monday.
Great, thank you.
Oops, I'm sorry, this is Cindy.
Okay, Cindy, I was just going
me?
to let you guys all know that if you go to that website that we talked about earlier, we have the agenda and their flyer on there, so you can download those as well.
Great. Sarah, who will be presenting the class or leading the class?
The facilitators will be our interpreter program administrator, who's Elisa Butler, and then Christy Racines, and she was the interpreter program administrator until she was elected as the state auditor, but she will also be there if we hold the orientation. So you'll have two people.
Okay. And has Juanita Flores's role changed? Is she still part of working with the state, or is she just working with the county? Okay.
She's still an employee of the circuit court in Jackson, but the facilitator for the program is Elisa Butler.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Okay.
When was the last time this training was offered?
It honestly has been, I think, 1.5 to 2 years ago.
Oh, okay. Okay. And if you don't have 6 people, it's going to be canceled? That's what you said?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Hmm.
Currently, right now, we only have 2 individuals that are registered.
Okay. Any more questions, anybody?
And if you do have questions at a later time, you can go ahead and email the email address that's on the court interpreter program agenda, or call Elisa. She is out of the office today, but her phone will ring over to me, and I'll certainly be happy to help you.
Great, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we'll go on to our next item at the end. We have an evaluation of our program that we did today. So if anyone will look in their chat box, you'll see this link to our SurveyMonkey evaluation, and we'd be happy to get any feedback. And if you have any future trainings that you would like, we'll be looking for presenters on that. And I think that's pretty much it for today. So I'd like to thank our presenters for presenting today. And if we can still continue with questions, if you have any questions, I just thought this was so informative. Thank you, Nora, for sharing with us all your expertise. And I think this is going to be a great presentation to share with our attorneys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.